How are we doing out there?
Hey.
Each year, at this time of the year, I am inspired by our fifth graders. So I want to thank you this morning for being our teachers. Because you have reminded us hard-hearted people, of what we value and what we hold dear. Values like kindness. I'm not sure that I could have stood up to that girl. Like treating each person with respect, like caring for our planet. You know, the Dalai Lama says that kindness is like water. You can't live without it. These values seem like no-brainers. I've heard people who enter our church look at the 7 principles and say, duh. They remind us, though, how we want to live and how we want the world to be, but the truth is, as our 5th graders reminded us, that people are often not kind. They are not fair. They are not respectful or caring. So this morning, my sermon is not necessarily going to be a comforter. I'm going to tell a few hard stories about the world we live in. These stories aren't easy to tell, nor are they easy to hear, and nevertheless, in this congregation, we do not shy away from the hard stories. We sing "Comfort Me" because we know that the world can be hard. We hold the discomfort of these stories so that we may work as our mission calls us toward healing the world. And so I begin with this one. A few months ago, I ordered an item on Amazon at 10 o'clock in the morning. It arrived that afternoon. I think it was somewhere before 2 p.m. And I marveled as I held the package in my hand. What a world we live in. I ordered this at 10. But then deeper within me, little warning bells started to go off. And then I wondered, who had to suffer to get me this package? What toxicity is being born in the world so that I get this package at 2 p.m.? I didn't have answers to these questions, but I sort of held them there in my heart. The answer came 2 weeks ago on the Daily's podcast, the podcast from the New York Times. It was called "The Human Toll of Instant Delivery." On October 27th, 2017, this is just over a year ago, a woman named Linda went to work at her warehouse job in Memphis. She wasn't feeling well at all that day. Nevertheless, she needed money to support her family, and if she didn't show up for work, her supervisor would dock her a point. And if she reached 9 points, she automatically lost her job. No excuses. So when Linda walked through the doors and she went through the metal detectors, and unfortunately the wire in her bra always set the detector off, so it always took her a long time to get through. And so when she got through security, she went to the break room to store her stuff because she wasn't allowed to take anything, including cell phones, onto the floor. She gave thanks that it was October in Memphis, because the warehouse wasn't as hot as it normally is. Memphis gets quite hot, and so the warehouse can often soar 100, 125 degrees, and that heat would have made her feel even worse. Linda went to the conveyor belt in the big box section of her job. Her job required a lot of heavy lifting, thus the big box section. And as the morning wore on, she did not feel any better, and in fact, she was feeling much worse. So, like a child at school, she raised her hand to her supervisor and asked if she could go home. Her supervisor would not authorize it. She would lose a point. Linda went back to the conveyor, and a few minutes later, she fell. And as she fell, she hit her head, and then she lay there on the ground. Her coworkers ran to her, wanting to help her, but her supervisor stood there and told them not to touch her. They had to keep working. They couldn't get behind schedule. An hour and a half later, Linda was still on the floor.
Whoa.
2 hours, 3 hours. Supervisors confirmed that Linda was dead, that she had had a heart attack. That's why she was feeling unwell. But what the supervisor said shocked the employees. Oh well, people die, but the customers still expect their deliveries. None of you is ever going to want to shop online again. That's not the problem. You see, Linda worked at a company called XPO. It's been called one of the biggest companies that most people have never heard of. XPO is a $12 billion logistics company that works with online retailers who have to compete with Amazon to retain their customers. It is one of the fastest growing companies with 98,000 employees in locations like Memphis, where it really is the best job in town for people without high school and college degrees. It allows them to pay their bills and to take care of their families. It is a good job. For Tasha Morrell, one of Linda's coworkers, what she witnessed on October 27th was the last straw. In her words, her warehouse job, though the pay was good, was modern slavery. It favored expediency over humanity. I'm going to say that again. It favored expediency over humanity, because these jobs were not designed for human beings. They were designed for robots. And Linda's death was a wake-up call that the workers needed a union of people who would fight for their rights. So Tasha reached out to the Teamsters. Her own story, Tasha's story, along with Linda's, put pressure on XPO to improve working conditions in Memphis, and it did. Tasha no longer works at XPO. It's now her goal in life to unionize warehouse companies. She calls it her everyday fight. However, experts agree in their reporting of this story that it's unlikely to ever happen. Most of her coworkers are focused on simply getting through their day. And even if Tasha did build a union, it would be a very small victory, because it's not going to change the huge macroeconomic problems that are occurring in our country. Because you see, our country's economy today and since its founding is built on the backs of other human beings. Our prosperity only comes at the expense of someone else's poverty. Should we start singing Comfort Me? Listening to this story, I was reminded, I actually had an image of the barrel of sugar at the National Museum of African American History and Culture in DC. It's one I will never forget. White gold, as it was called by British colonists, was the engine of the slave trade. One spoonful of sugar to sweeten your tea meant the enslavement of an entire people and the genocide of others to get the land. And so my expectation for speedy delivery of goods now felt inexplicably tied, linked to that spoonful of sugar, that barrel of sugar. Soon after I heard this story, I also heard an interview with Anand Giridharadas, who Lauren shared with us. I don't know if you've heard about his new book. He's the author of a book called Winners Take All. In 2015, at the Aspen Institute, he gave a speech that spoke of America's new gilded age of extreme winners and extreme losers. And I'm going to repeat a little bit of what he shared in that speech. He said, "We here in Aspen are in a bit of a tight spot. We are sponsored, like the Institute is sponsored by the extreme winners of our country. This community was founded by the stalwarts of American capitalism. We sit in spaces named after Pepsi, the beverage, and Coke, the brothers. We are deeply enmeshed and invested in the establishment and systems that we are also supposed to question. And yet, We are a community of leaders that seek justice. But these identities are tricky to reconcile. Ghirardellis does not stop there, and he says, the winners of our age are always challenged to do more good, but we must never ever tell them to do less harm. The winner's response is to soften the blows of the system, but to preserve the system at any cost. And then he compares our current economic system with the practice of buying papal indulgences in the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages. Get ready, I'm scared to tell you. He said people paid off their sins to the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages. And Ghirardellis says we have a modern version of this. Don't feel bad about your prosperity in the midst of vast prosperity, he says. Just give to charity. It's also a tax write-off. My friends, Ghirardellis says, knowing that he too is implicated, that we have substituted generosity for justice. I'm reminded in hearing him and holding the discomfort of what he's saying with the Starfish Story. You know, the one that's told so often that it's almost cliche. It goes, two children, two beings, run down the beach to the ocean. And up and down the beach, they notice that there are thousands of starfish that have washed ashore. And one child picks up one starfish and throws it back into the ocean. And the other child watches and asks, why are you doing this? You can't save all these starfish. And the first child picks up another starfish and hurls it back into the ocean and says, well, I made a difference to that one. And then often in this feel-good story, other people along the beach seeing this child join in until all of the starfish are saved, right? You should know that this story has another ending, one that has been adapted, one without the feel-good ending, an ending that leaves us in the discomfort of a question that does not have an answer. You see, as that last starfish is thrown, the second child stares out into the ocean, having never picked up a starfish, brow furrowed in a question. The first child turns to the other one and says, why do you not celebrate? We just saved all the starfish from baking in the sun. And the second child says, I want to know what's happening in the water that caused all the starfish to jump ship. Maybe they have more to fear from the ocean than they do from the sun. I heard the same message from the new executive director of Bridges last Sunday here in our congregation. If you will remember, at Bridges, volunteers go out onto the street in places like Lower Manhattan and Newark and Irvington to hand out bagged meals and toiletries to people who are homeless or who are food insecure. Rich, the executive director, reminded us of the importance of the work. It's vital. It's vital to feed people. It's vital to build relationships across the divides that our communities are, and to offer that kindness that our fifth graders talked about. That said, Rich opened our eyes to a larger problem. Why are people hungry and homeless in our prosperous state of New Jersey, in our country? What's wrong with the ocean? In the Christian calendar, we are in the season of Advent, a season of great anticipation for the birth of the baby Jesus. And a few weeks ago, I heard the very right Reverend Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas, who is the Dean of the Episcopal Divinity School. That's why I pulled out my, nice Episcopalian robes today. I heard her tell a story about her childhood. She recalled riding in the car with her family. She was a little kid, seeing two children her age walking down the streets of Dayton, Ohio, and they were walking in a cold, wet rain. It was the week of Christmas, and as she sat in her church on Christmas Eve, Douglas heard that there was no place for the baby Jesus in Bethlehem, no home, no inn, just a stable, just a manger. And Douglas thought about the baby Jesus and connected it immediately with those two children, wondering if there was somewhere for them to sleep. And as she sang, "Away in a manger," tears streamed down her face. And she made a vow then as a child to make the world one where all children would have a safe, dry place to sleep. Her vow was to save those two children, yes, those two starfish, but also to change the world, to alter the system that allows children to go hungry and homeless. That story gave her a calling. She was no older than the children who sit in the front row today. It is no wonder that the man whose first bed was a manger would go on to instruct his disciples with the following words: "No one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one or love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money." And so Anand Girdas endeavored to sow the seed of a difficult conversation in Aspen in 2015, and now he endeavors to do that with a larger world, a conversation that asks, will our dominant language be that of the market, a prosperity built on the backs of others' poverty? Or will we learn new languages, the languages of values and morality, of spirituality and humanity, of contemplation and action that helps us serve humanity as a whole? In the last week, as we talked in my family about the challenges we face, we were driving along and my eldest daughter said, "Mom, I just wish I had 3 wishes. If I had 3 wishes, I would wish that we had solved our climate change problems, and then I would wish that human beings were at peace, and then I would wish for 3 more wishes so that I could solve the rest of the problems." And I just said, "Oh, Lucy, wouldn't that be lovely?" But according to Andrew Zolli, the expert on resiliency, that's not the right wish. The 20th century, the century that Andrew Zolli and I grew up in, taught us that we could solve any problem and that every problem was solvable. That's what the 20th century taught us. We believed that we could essentially out-engineer failure. Then, in a blink of an eye, we moved from a period of relative tranquility to one of real disruption. And that's what these 5th graders have been raised in. They were born in 2007 and 2008, the year of the huge economic collapse. How history has shaped them is very different than how history has shaped my generation and the generations prior to me. The generations of the 20th century want to fix the problem of vast inequality so that the future generations won't have to deal with it. But our children know that we can't just fix the problem. There are no 3 wishes. We live within a network of so-called wicked problems, because the problems, as Zolli says, are big and complex and they're interdependent, and we are enmeshed in them. He says that if you pulled on one string, if you tried to solve one problem on the giant hairball of problems, 6 or 7 things would happen. And often you don't make the situation better, and in fact, sometimes you actually make it worse. And that's why this is the age of humility. Because we can't fix the problems outright. We will try and fail and try and fail. And that, for people of my generation, will feel defeating. We will sit in despair. But for our children, it is the air they breathe. Zolli calls them cheerfully earnest. Journalist Rebecca Traister says, when people ask, what do we do? How do we make it better? How do we do it differently? Very often my answer comes down to listen to the people around you. Be curious about what they're angry about. And then when you seek their answers, listen to them. Take them on, consider them, give them political weight, give them intellectual weight. Imagine that the anger around you is a valid anger, as your anger is. And it's there that Andrew Zolli says we can expand the edge of change by making sure that Linda's story is not forgotten, but that we dare to tell it in our sanctuaries. It is started by listening to Tasha Mullen's anger, by joining her everyday fight, a fight that is heard by people like Anand Girdadas and others who are both winners and justice seekers, which causes them to question the system that hands them prosperity at the expense of justice for others, which causes them to launch hard conversations without easy answers. And there, in that conversation of sharing hard stories and listening to anger and living the question, that's where the edge of change occurs. I have no easy answers, just a song. Comfort me. And so let us be brave enough to journey with our fifth graders who have sat so well through this long sermon into the century of humility. Amen.
Amen.